I'm Peter Boland, and we have another segment of the podcast, and I have a very special guest today, the author of The Rich Flee and the Poor Take the Bus. And Troy, I was just delighted to read this book. It came at a very crucial time in the research I was doing for my current book. It really informed me that what we're looking at in terms of social policy and investment in social infrastructure has so much to do with the chain of thinking that you've gone through to arrive at many of your points. And I was just, delighted to say that there's a book out there that everybody ought to be reading. So again, terrific book. And it's a large book. I think it's what, 437 pages. But I also want to give you a shout out to your terrific, very accessible Substack called At the Margin, which is a clever name in itself. And I was curious that even in today's posting, you were talking about the state of affairs in South Carolina and the measles outbreak. So it just reinforces what we'll be talking about today. These are very current issues. They're not going away. We're going to have to deal with them. So,
Yeah.
with that intro, I'd love to know more about how you came to Fordham. Why are you an economist? What's your background, and how did you arrive at Fordham? And what do you do there?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the very generous introduction of both the book and the Substacks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've got kind of a winding history. So I graduated undergrad and I actually went into mortgage banking and was
Oh,
working in mortgage banking during kind of the first subprime lending boom and eventually moved on from there. Went back to grad school and was getting my PhD in economics. And I work primarily in labor economics and looking at how social connections influence the jobs that people got and income inequality and workplace segregation and those kind of things. But there was kind of a central feature of my work in labor economics that had to do with social networks, right? Who people know and who they interact with and whatnot. And then shortly after I got my PhD, I ended up at Fordham University in New York City, and a colleague of mine in grad school, her husband was an MD public health professional, and he was interested in vaccine uptake in hospitals, which
sure.
people are. I was amazed when he told me this, but the fraction of doctors and nurses and people that work in hospitals that actually get their flu vaccines is shockingly low. It's like
Yeah. Yep.
just it's in like the in many places like the 20 to 30% range, which to me
Yeah.
just blows my mind. But he was interested in trying to get those levels up. And of course, being an economist, right, we sort of think about, how do you best spend your money and your resources and whatnot. So he was interested in which particular groups within the hospital would be most important to have vaccinated if there was an outbreak of some contagious disease. So we kind of leverage my knowledge of network analysis and social network analysis
Okay.
to collect some data and design this interaction model within the hospital to figure out who were the most important people to get vaccinated. And we found some surprising things. Like, I usually make folks like guess what they might be, but it turns out that like receptionists are the most important people to vaccinate in a hospital because they're really the
Hmm.
hub of interactions, right?
Yeah.
So doctors see them, patients' families see them, the patients see them, the food service folks, everybody kind of interacts with those people. And this, I thought it was just kind of an amazing result that we found, and it really piqued my interest in sort of using this social network analysis to work in the public health field. And so that's kind of how I arrived at this intermixing of public health, epidemiology, and economics. Um,
So, what drove you to write this book?
Um, yeah, so once I got to Fordham and started working in this area, they allowed me to teach this course in our master's in an interdisciplinary master's program that really looked at exactly what that research was about. So
Hmm.
mix of economics, public health, epidemiology, and social justice and health equity. And so I've been teaching that course for almost 2 decades when COVID hit. And I'd always kind of had in the back of my mind that I thought this stuff was important. And this social scientists, economists mixing with public health fields, I thought was important. And I just, when COVID hit and there was all of these unequal outcomes of
Right.
mortality and economic effects, and just everything was affected unequally, it just seemed like it was the time that I had to write this book. Um, I literally sat down my kids went back to school on, I forget the exact date, but the first week in January, and I sat down at the kitchen table and I started writing in January of 2021 and pretty much
Yep. Yep.
wrote it straight through.
Yeah. All right. So, what would you like the audience today to appreciate about the book? What are two or three things you hope that we can learn from your 437 pages?
Yeah, I wish it was a smidge shorter, but there
Yeah.
was just too much stuff. I couldn't cut couldn't cut it more. Um, but I mean, the big thing is just the interplay between epidemic outbreaks and excuse me, and economic inequality. We heard things when the pandemic took off that there were these videos of like Madonna and Governor Cuomo, right, saying that everybody was at risk, and this was the great equalizer, right, was the phrase, and of course it was anything but.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
know some basic statistics. Probably everyone knows, right, that Black and Hispanic and Native American populations were harmed much more severely, both
Right.
economically and in terms of health outcomes than white, more privileged, more wealthy groups. But the analysis, I think, that was out there really falls short, right? Not sort of fully appreciating that, um, it's about the way that we've organized society in terms of our living conditions, our access to healthcare, and our access to healthcare, not just during the pandemic, but um, prior to the pandemic that left people with,
Sure.
comorbidities and whatnot that harmed them more when the pandemic arrived. And I really wanted to walk through all of the social science, both about living conditions, um, access to healthcare, but also about people's behavior and how people taking, actions, that actions sort of based upon arguments of individual rights had effects on other people in society, and that you can never, in the midst of a pandemic or a public health crisis, have a you do you, I'll do me sort of attitude,
Right.
and that doesn't have effects on other people. That we don't live in a vacuum. So when you have epidemic outbreaks, and it's impossible to not have everyone in it together.
Well, you use the phrase pandemic dilemma. What does
Yeah.
that mean?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a play on so in social sciences we talk about social dilemmas, and
Right.
they're usually this friction between individual choices or individual optimization and the outcomes for a social group of people. So just as a simple example, like that, imagine that there's a small society and there's 10 people that go fish in a pond, and maybe if those people are left to their own devices, that they will catch 10 fish a day. But an ecologist comes and looks and says, well, if you keep catching 10 fish a day, the fish are all going to disappear in a couple of years and then you won't have any fish. So they set a rule that says, you can only catch 8 fish a day. And if everybody adheres to that, then the pond will keep thriving with fish and everything will be great. But the problem with that then becomes that if some people cheat on that um, the people that sort of play by the rules end up paying double the cost, in the sense that
Mhm.
let's suppose 50% of the population keep on catching 10 fish. Well, the people that are behaving and acting the way they should, they can't catch 8 fish, because if they do, you're still going to drive the fish population away. So they have to cut back down to maybe 6 fish. So they have to pay, in some sense, double. They have to limit their behavior back to what's sustainable,
Okay.
but then
I
they
get
have to
it.
go even
Yep.
further because of the actions of other people. And if you think about, what's going on, what went on in the pandemic, we saw that over and over again, right? That Some people were adhering to, say, a mask mandate, and other people had their mask on the chin. Well, if people aren't playing by the rules, if they aren't doing the things to keep other people safe, then the people that want to keep other people safe have to lower, they have to be even more careful than they would be otherwise. And so
Well, I think
there's,
one of the main themes you keep coming back to in the book is that that individual choice, like you're talking about, can really lead to collective failure, whether it be the pond and fishing or whatever else. I
yeah.
found that really to be a very powerful statement because uh, during COVID, the notion of personal choice, I think, becomes something of a rallying cry. And you say the personal choice leads to making choices for the public as well. Say more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I make a distinction in the book between what I call health risk and exposure risk, right? And we talked a lot about risk during the pandemic. And when we talked about that, we usually meant something like people having a health condition that would lead them
Okay.
to have a worse outcome, right? If you get sick, if you've got diabetes, you're more likely to die, right? But there's this other piece, which is a shared risk that I call exposure risk.
Right.
And it's the fact that when we have an infectious disease, that everything that I do, every risk that I take, every time that I don't wear a mask or I don't social distance or I have a dinner party in my house when I'm not supposed to, that's creating additional exposures in society. And then those exposures are shared by everyone else, right? So no matter what I do, I'm sharing any risk that I take with everyone that I come in contact subsequent to taking that risk. And
I found myself a couple times going back to, I forget which section it was, but you talk about a phrase, second factor. What do you mean by second factor? How does that apply today?
yeah, it really, I mean, it comes out in a couple of different ways. So one is what I was talking about before that, like with the fish, right? Instead of only catching eight, you've got to drop down to six,
Right,
right? So instead of socially distancing, you've got to socially distance and wear a mask or socially distance longer. But then there's also the second factor, which is that it's not just the people around me, but there's sort of, I sometimes describe it as like tossing a rock into a pond, right? And you have those
right,
ripples that are going out. And we very frequently don't think about those additional ripples, right? If I get sick, I might think about protecting my wife and my kids by staying in my bedroom. But also by doing that, I'm stopping my wife and kids from getting sick and infecting the people at their place of work and their
right.
schools and whatnot. And so, everything just kind of keeps bubbling out from the individual and having these additional effects in society.
I mean, we live in a interconnected world and more an interconnected society. And it really raises the question, are we doomed to repeat the sins of our past with the next pandemic?
Yeah, that's a scary question.
Yeah,
Um, we one of the things I talk a little bit about in the book is it wasn't just the pandemic and it wasn't just individual behavior within the pandemic. It was also all the things that we entered the pandemic with.
yeah.
Namely, I know you read about health equity and social inequality and whatnot. And we've got all these cracks in society of unequal access to healthcare, of income inequality, of low wage workers being more harmed when there's a recession. And the kind of Panglossian Pollyanna view would be that we get this pandemic and we see all of these unequal effects across society, and then we kind of take a magnifying glass and we look at where all these cracks and fissures were, and we try to address them. And I think that we've really missed the boat, right? We've sort of decided that that pandemic was a one-off. Let's just go back to the way society was. I think the individual rights folks, the ultra free market folks that uh, have really dug in, and I think that if anything, the pandemic has left us in a worse situation than where we began, just because of
Well,
the political
I
polarization.
I have a comment on that coming up.
Okay.
I had a I guess underlines is the right word. Let me
Mhm.
see if I get this right. It's a quote or my interpretation. Hold on a
Yeah.
second. History determines constraints and community determines risk. And together they created unequal outcomes during a pandemic. Is that basically what you're trying to convey here?
Yeah, in many ways. We entered the pandemic in a social situation
Yeah,
and in a particular situation in terms of socioeconomics. And that situation was a product of history, both at a community level and at an individual level, right? So when, just as a perhaps silly example, when I became a university professor, I didn't think like, okay, I'm going to become a university professor because when a pandemic comes, I can teach remotely from my home, right? And the MTA, that Metro Transit Authority worker in New York City that, rides on the trains and collects tickets, didn't think like, okay, I'm going to not worry about the pandemic and I'm going to work on the train,
right.
right? Um, but my choice a long time ago gave me a lot of safety, and the MTA workers' choice gave them much less safety. Um, so we made all of these choices from history, and it's not just these individual choices, but it's these societal choices, right? Prior to the ACA, we had almost 20% of people without health insurance.
Yeah,
Uh, it got better with the ACA in 2014, but we still had, approaching 10% of people without health insurance. And then a pandemic arrives, right? If we knew the pandemic was coming, would we have done something different? Perhaps, right? We would have made sure that people had better health care and maybe
yeah.
society would have been better off. That's the optimistic view, but we see post-pandemic that, if anything, we're going in the other direction to cutting healthcare access
Well,
to
let
other
me
people.
raise a slightly
Right?
different slant on this that you spend
Yeah.
a lot of pages talking about the critical importance of information and particularly misinformation during the
Yeah.
pandemic. And one of my favorite parts of the book is I'm not a motorcycle person, but
Oh,
I was fascinated by your conversation. You go into a lot of detail about the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally in South Dakota. Hundreds of thousands of people come in. I guess my question is, do people just basically want to believe what they believe? And if that was the case in Sturgis, what was the impact? And is that what we're left with at the present day? People will believe what they want to believe.
I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, right? So
Okay.
that this Sturgis Motorcycle Rally was so it's been held for a little bit over 50 years, but it started off as
Yeah.
a small motorcycle race, and then it's grown to, hundreds of thousands, approaching
Yeah.
1 million people that come to this small little town in South Dakota for this big motorcycle rally where people sort of roll in on their Harleys and whatnot.
Yeah.
And in August of 2020, there was this big argument about, whether they should stop the rally from happening. So Kristi Noem was the governor of South Dakota at the
Right.
time, so you can imagine what her impression was that she was like, let people do what they want to do. And eventually, the rally happened. And not surprisingly, when you put 500,000 people together in this small little town and bars and concerts and restaurants and all this other stuff, the epidemic just rolled out of Sturgis. And if you look roughly a month after the Sturgis motorcycle rally, you could trace cases back, and they talk more about how they do this in the book, but um, about 10% of the cases in the US could be traced back in some way to that
Oh,
Sturgis motorcycle rally, which is just crazy. Um, and within that rally, I leaned on some interviews with reporters did at the New York Times and excuse me, other newspapers and whatnot. And a lot of people were saying, well, it's a risk. I know there's a risk, but it's a risk I'm not going to worry about.
yeah.
Now, I think that, at a bigger picture, however, I think I don't think it's that people just believe what they want to believe. I think that in part, there's some economic factors that, for a small business person who has their business shut down, say a restaurant owner, their views, may be colored a bit by the fact that they've got economic harm here. So, through cognitive dissonance or something, maybe they don't want to believe it. Um, on the other hand, though, I think people rely a lot on local data, right? So there's a good study by some folks at NYU who looked at the behavior and the opinions of the pandemic um, between people that had Facebook friends in New York early on in the pandemic and folks that didn't. And what they found was that people who knew people who had experienced what happened in New York City in March and April were much more cautious about the pandemic,
Hmm.
presumably just because they knew people that
Yeah.
perhaps had died, had been severely sick, or knew people who knew people kind of stuff. So I think that people did lean on local information. And then the third piece of this, though, is that it's what I sometimes call the child in the matchbook example that I think played out pretty strongly in COVID. And this does get a little bit back to believe what you want to believe. But the example that I sometimes give is, and well, I'll ask you, did you ever play with matches when you were a kid?
No, never.
No, never. Okay, you're the bad example. So I asked this in my class, right? And there's always someone that raises their hand, and they said, "Yeah, I played with matches." And usually it's a guy, so there's probably some bias there. I don't know quite what it is, but usually someone admits to playing with matches. And I say, "Did your parents tell you not to?" And they say, "Of course, they told me not to play with matches." And then I say, "Did you burn your house down?" And then they usually say no, right? And so part of I think what was going on in at the height of COVID was people, um, you know, most people who were infected didn't get severely ill, right?
Sure. Right.
And it's kind of like don't play with matches, right? Well, I played with matches. I lit some matches. I didn't burn my house down. My parents were foolish for telling me not to play with matches. But the problem, of course, is that, maybe it's 1 out of 100, 1 out of 10, 1 out of whatever do get severely sick. And if you don't happen to be someone who sees that, then you just think that this pandemic danger is just a bunch of bunk. And so I think that the people sort of looking for individual stories around them and then generalizing, I think caused a lot of polarization during the
Yeah.
pandemic. Um,
Agreed.
and so I think it's, well, overall, I kind of agree with you that, maybe it was people believing what they want to believe. I think that what they did a lot of the time was they found some snippet of data or some snippet of personal experience to lean on to justify it.
Let me
Um,
push this further that you
yeah,
made a comment I thought was very prescient that COVID became something of a battlefield over my safety, my finances, my health, my freedom. And if you take that, and they did a terrific job, does this also apply to things outside of COVID? It does, of course. And you made a terrific leap into it also applies to pollution. And there
sure.
can be any number of social contexts we can apply this to. And what I'm trying to think my way through that if as a, we make individual choices, we make societal choices. There's individual risk, there's collective risk. And if we look back at COVID, 1.2 million deaths and 14 plus trillion-dollar hit to the economy, did we learn a lot from COVID as the pathway to go forward? And my concern is that I don't think that we did. And as a public policy person, I'm looking at, well, what would make us pay more attention to the individual risk and collective risk, whether it be, 2.4 million deaths, 4.8, 9.6. What is an acceptable level of societal risk? And then we get back to what's my responsibility for individual risk and how does that pertain to the larger population? So when you begin to apply this to a larger context as an economist and you're looking at social inequality trends, at the same time, I have to say that since COVID, disparities have grown. Certainly, wider income equality is certainly higher than it was. More people without health insurance, which means not access to preventive measures as well. So, as an economist, and you're looking at how we relate this to social inequality trends, what sense do you make out of that going forward?
And I think, it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that what COVID gave us, and, not that I would like trade off having COVID for not, right, for this sort of lens, but it really gave us this magnifying glass to see all of these problems in
Yeah,
society. And I mean, to me, it's just absolutely tragic that we haven't done something with that magnifying glass, right? So that when I teach sort of an undergraduate course as well as a graduate course that I was talking about earlier. And I start both of those classes by talking about New York City.
Hmm.
And I put up a map of New York, and there's this fabulous neighborhood, if you're not familiar with New York, called Jackson Heights. It's just south of LaGuardia
Sure.
Airport. It's this fabulously diverse neighborhood, great restaurants, huge like melting pot of people from all different cultures and whatnot. And if you look at the rate of death in the first, just in the year 2020, deaths in Jackson Heights were 5 to 6 times larger than they were in the
Right.
financial district. It's just,
Striking.
it blows you away, right? So the example I give is imagine that given, all the deaths we had in New York in 2020 from COVID, if you roll a die, right, if it comes up six, then somebody in Lower Manhattan dies. If it comes up one, two, three, four, or five, somebody in a neighborhood like Jackson Heights dies. And if you just think about that for a minute, just, it blows your mind. At least it does mine. And it's not that, those people were just unlucky, right? You can trace it back to
Hmm.
a lack of access to healthcare, to economic inequality, to needing to ride the bus to work, to the fact that people in Lower Manhattan had the money to flee, to get out of the city and keep themselves safe. And so there's one thing after another that led to these people in Jackson Heights just paying a huge cost relative to
Yeah.
other people. And, as you mentioned, right, we're continuing to see income inequality grow, wealth inequality grow. The things have, if anything, gotten worse since the pandemic. And of course, there's a subset of people that have taken the lesson seriously and see these connections. And I hope my book plays a little bit of a role in helping some people to see it. Um, but it really should have been a lesson that um, we could use to inform us about lessening the social ills that we have, and it just hasn't been. At
I
least I don't
mean,
think it has been.
common sense would seem to suggest that if you look at the correlates involved in all of this, that if the underlying ill health or poor health of society prior to COVID was perhaps, if not the main, one of the main reasons why our astronomical death and misery rates were so high relative to other, wealthy countries. It would seem to suggest that we should be investing in social health infrastructure if, in fact, we want to raise the overall population to inoculate ourselves, so to speak, to the next pandemic. And there will be a next pandemic. So I would, turn this question around and what do you teach your students as an economist about this going forward?
Yeah, well, I think I mean, economics often gets like a bad take as the dismal science, right? Or we teach students about individual optimization, and we sort of lose altruism and caring for your neighbors and even
Yeah,
your families and whatnot. But I think one of the other courses that I teach is a game theory class where we talk a lot about these social dilemmas,
right.
and we see that if everyone acts in their own selfish best interest, that you often don't end up with something that anyone likes, right? Just like the fishing example we talked about earlier. Um, and I think there is a danger though, as you mentioned, the our ill health prior to the pandemic certainly contributed to the U.S. doing far worse than, say, com
Correct.
comparative countries. And I think the danger is that when you have someone like, for instance, RFK Jr. in power right now, he attributes that ill health very much in an individualistic sense, right? That people need to individually eat their fruits and vegetables and then everything will be better, right? But if you look at what happened during the pandemic, I don't think that was a lot of it, right? It was the lack of access to healthcare. It was people living in low-income neighborhoods that maybe were in food deserts or pharmacy deserts.
Sure.
There's all of these societal factors that lead to people having ill health. And there are things that are controllable from a policy perspective that isn't just like, let's flip the food pyramid around and then everything's better, right? Which,
Well, good point. Let me suggest a positive way to wrap this up.
yeah, yeah.
Given all the scholarships that's gone into your writing and what's yet to come, what gives you optimism about going forward as an economist?
Yeah, I think I've thought about that because I mean, my political leanings are probably obvious just from this interview, but it's been a rather depressing last year or so. And with everything going on, to me it's not a very optimistic time. But honestly, I was thinking about that over the weekend with the stuff going on in Minneapolis. And one of the things that kind of gives me hope, and I don't want to pin all my hope on another generation, but it's not as though everyone has just sort of deviated to this individualistic perspective. The folks that are out protesting in Minneapolis right now are, they're certainly not thinking that way. And I grew up in northern Michigan. Minneapolis is cold right now. So there's a lot of people that are, thinking about the collective good and thinking about their neighbors. And one of the things I think that gives me the most hope is if you look at the videos of this, a lot of those folks are younger. And I think that young folks today do have a much more collective spirit than people in the older generations. And over time, those folks are going to have more of the votes. And as long as we don't do something to corrupt the optimism that those folks have and the solidarity that those folks have, then it may not be immediate, but that does give me hope.
Well, economists always take the long view as well.
Oh, sure.
So, anyhow, Troy,
True.
Troy, this has been terrific. I enjoyed your book immensely. I've learned a lot
Thank
from
you.
you, and I would like to do this again. So,
Yeah,
thank
it'd be
you
great.
immense, and thank you for your optimism.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, and it was great chatting with you today. Thank you.
Thank you.